Hi, I'm Jackie Tantillo, and this is Should Have Listened to My Mother. It is so nice to be back with another episode of Should Have Listened to My Mother. You know, sometimes it's really hard for me to wait a week to post another show, but I do want to thank you for all of your support and your positive feedback. All of us have stories of at least one significant female role model in our life. This week's guest has a thrilling story to share and surely will not disappoint. We are recording this episode on June 19th, 2024, now a federal holiday, Juneteenth, acknowledging a day back in 1865 commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, 2 years after Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had been signed. It's an opportunity to honor the ancestors who paved the way for so many, those who have passed and those of future generations. Had Dr. Faith Mitchell not unlocked a trunk her mother left behind, and had Faith not opened that trunk, perhaps all these treasures would have been lost forever. This is an opportunity for Dr. Mitchell to share very personal stories from her grandmother Emma's postcards. A little bit about Dr. Faith Mitchell. She was raised in rural Michigan. As a young girl, she fell madly in love with plants and being in the woods. My guest has an undergrad degree in anthropology from the University of Michigan, a doctorate in medical anthropology from University of California, Berkeley. Faith refers to herself as an ethnographer, one who studies people and cultures. She's the author of Hoodoo Medicine, a study of Black folk medicine from the 1600s from the area of the South Carolina Sea Islands. The Book of Secrets, Part 1, a supernatural thriller, and Emma's Postcard Album, Black Lives in the Early 20th Century, a memoir and social history. My guest is very accomplished, and we're just scratching the surface of her accomplishments and her resume. Hi, Dr. Mitchell. It's a pleasure to have you on Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Hi, Jackie. Thanks for having me. Please call me Faith. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you.
Well, when I was doing my research, you're so studied and experienced. You eventually went into philanthropic works nationally and internationally. And here we are talking about this trove of goodies that you found in a trunk that your mom had kept locked up.
That's right.
Interesting. She didn't want anything to get out, perhaps, until it was the right time. What is your mom's name? What was your mom's name?
My mother's name was Ophelia Mitchell.
And where was she born and raised?
She was from Chester County, Pennsylvania, from a family that, as I describe in the book, Emma's Postcard Album, had lived in Pennsylvania since it was a colony. And that history of the family, they had the fortune of being free Black people, not having been enslaved within their living memories, so to speak. And they were very proud of that heritage. And even though my mother kept the postcards a secret, and then I didn't discover them until after she had died, she freely shared the history of the family as I was growing up, because that was a really important part of her identity, and she made it an important part of mine.
So was there something that she did not want revealed? No, she was proud of her family's past.
She was. It's funny that you asked that question, though, because on the one hand, my mother was like a griot, that term in the West African oral history where, the history is passed down over hundreds of years by someone who's designated as the oral historian, and she very much played that role in my life. So she was always talking about the family history, as I was saying. At the same time, she could be secretive. as my cousins and I, and the whole family was like that. And so I don't know in the case of the postcards, or maybe there was something else in that locked trunk, and I just landed on the postcards. Maybe it was something else she was actually keeping secret. But I did go through that trunk after she had died. Once I'd found the key, I didn't find anything that was damning in it. But when people are secretive, what they consider worth keeping secret may or may not be what someone else considers worth, hiding, concealing.
Sure. What was she like as a mom? You sent me a picture of the two of you exploring. You mentioned that she was very much interested in you exploring and experiencing new things.
She was. You know how some people seem very different from their parents in some ways, whether it's the path they've taken in their life or their values or whatever. But when I'm being honest with myself, I would say I am so much my mother's daughter. She was a well-educated woman well before her time. She was a teacher. She was educated as a teacher. She was born in 1914. I should go back. She had me rather late in life. So between the time when she was, born and when she had me, she had a couple of careers. She taught in Pennsylvania, and then she came to Washington, D.C., and finished her education. She had like an AA degree at first in Pennsylvania. Then she came to Washington, D.C., attended Howard Minor Teachers College, which was the premier Black teachers school of its day and was part of Howard University at the time. Then she didn't start teaching right away because there were actually not that many jobs in the North for Black teachers, and she didn't want to teach down South. So she went into working with the federal government instead in the 40s and kind of rose to, through the ranks as high as Black women could rise at that point. And then moved to Michigan, where she taught, and then she met my dad, got married, had me. So I always think of myself as the beneficiary of, all those years of experience she had teaching previously, working in D.C. She learned several languages. She was a voracious reader, and by the time I came along, her only kid, she just filled me with all of that information so that I was reading at an early age. And I used to play with her teaching materials and didn't even realize how unusual that was because she would just give them to me to work with. But she was of that generation that was very focused on upward mobility. Her dad had come to the United States from the Caribbean to attend college. He wasn't able to finish, but he came with those values. And her mother had a high school education. She had wanted to go to nursing school, but she got married and started having kids instead. But the family was educationally oriented, and my mother just drilled that into me, that kind of two things, that Black people have to progress, and two, education is the way to progress. But when I was saying very much the values of her period, that focus on what my mother would call making something of yourself. And she wasn't overtly a feminist, but she had, if I had had a brother, I think she would have had the same values for both of us. She didn't distinguish between, what a woman could achieve and what a man could achieve. And my dad was the same way. They are both just pushing me, make something of yourself. Don't be part of the common herd. It's not a sentiment that you hear as much today. I think it's not fashionable anymore, but certainly for their generation, it was a driving value.
So I have a couple of questions because I love that. And I'm curious, was it because they saw the discrimination or the trials and tribulations as a Black family, a Black young woman? Did they feel that was going to be your lifeline, having the education? You mentioned that she went to the Howard Minor Teachers College.
For someone my mother's age, born in 1914, yes, education would have been
Segregated.
segregated, yeah, for the most part. There were a few exceptions. When you read the historical record, you'll occasionally see a black person who went to, Harvard or Dartmouth or some school like that. But by and large, everything was segregated.
Her message and your dad's message, was it always because we don't have the same rights as everybody else? Did they hammer home the darker aspects of what society was offering a black woman, let alone a black man? Or was it just they were so passionate and enjoyed all that they received and were fulfilled with from a wealth of education?
It was more the latter, and I am so grateful.
I hope so.
Now that I'm older, looking back, their message to me. So I was born in 1952, so still 12 years before the civil rights, revolution, so to speak. So I was born into a segregated country as well. And yet they fervently believed that the country was changing and that I needed to be prepared for a changing country. And they were right. The country was changing. So their message was optimistic rather than pessimistic. And their message to me was really, what you accomplish is up to you. So that's not entirely accurate, because we know there's racism and we know there's sexism. And it took me a while to figure that out. But they in a way, it was an empowering message. It's up to you. On another way, it was, not entirely accurate, as I'm saying. But they just, invested in me in terms of experiences. We're going to travel. We traveled at a time when very few black people traveled. We would go to national parks. And, I remember, white visitors at the parks would say awkward things to us. And we, oh, don't see folks like you out here very much, And even as a kid, I was like, ooh, what a weird, awkward thing for somebody to be saying, And my parents would have to kind of laugh it off. But they were determined to give me those experiences and to make sure that I went to good schools. You mentioned in the introduction that I grew up in this rural area of Michigan. And the reason I grew up in the rural area is that my dad worked for a research lab at the University of Michigan. And I can remember when we were moving to Ann Arbor from this suburb of Detroit, the realtor wanted to show my parents houses in this one little part of Ann Arbor proper, which was considered, the little black neighborhood. It was just a few streets, and it was associated with a poor school. And because my mother was a former teacher, she was very sensitive to the quality of education. And I can remember her saying to my father, I don't want to move and have Faith going to this second-rate school. So they ended up buying a house out in the country outside Ann Arbor in an area that was technically all white. It had one of those restrictive covenants associated with it that said that the property could not be sold to a non-white person. But the farmer who was trying to sell it was desperate, and he sold it to my dad. So I grew up in going to a better elementary school than I would have gone to if we'd been in town, and then by extension, actually a better junior high and a better high school. So they were always making decisions, I would say, with my future in mind, for which I am really grateful. And they were in a position to make those kinds of decisions. That's the other thing to be grateful for, to be able to say, we're not going to live in this neighborhood, we're going to try to live in another neighborhood, and so forth.
Which is a huge component of their whole picture, their whole perspective, their whole philosophy of life, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes yes. I think without you, whether it's naivete, they were protecting you, but they wanted to give you the optimism, the perspective that things are going to change. And I really admire that, because I'm sure they had plenty of conversations of concern for your safety and well-being, but thinking that this was the best way to influence you and to raise you was to reinforce, yes, the education, but the possibilities of the world. what your future could be.
Absolutely. You have captured it very well. One of my mother's favorite phrases, but that she used to say to me was, the parent opens the door and the child walks through. And so, she lived that motto. She was doing things to open those doors. And then, me realizing it's my job to walk through, not to hang back.
I would imagine you were not a shy child. Am I correct?
I was, though. I was kind of quiet. I was a good student, but I was, at least in my memory, Jackie, I was fairly quiet. And then I began to open up in certainly like junior high, high school. I gradually began to realize that being too quiet wasn't doing me any good. And but it's taken a while. I didn't start out being talkative and being unafraid of expressing myself.
When you and your mom, Ophelia, would go out on an adventure or go do something fun, what is something that you recall, something that stands out?
Well, actually, something that relates to the postcards is that there was a secondhand shop in Ann Arbor called the Treasure Mart that had a combination of, antiques and various secondhand items. We love to go there and, just go through things. I have always loved the past, and articles from the past. And I bought various things there, and my mother did as well. And I'm sure I saw old postcards there. It may well have awakened my interest in postcards, decades before I actually saw my grandmother's collection. But I've always been interested in the stories that the past could tell. And so that Treasure Mart, helped stimulate that interest.
Did you have family nearby? Relatives? Was your grandmother nearby?
My dad's family was nearby. My father was from Michigan. His family was nearby. The grandmother that I wrote about, Emma from Emma's Postcard Album, was in Pennsylvania. I had lived with her briefly when I was very young, and my father was still in graduate school. I'd stayed with her for a couple of years, but then was not in as close a touch with her when I got older and was just in Michigan. But I felt like I knew her well because, as I mentioned, my mother was like a griot, and my mother was one of those people who told stories, whether it's about something that happened yesterday or something that happened, 10 years ago or 100 years ago. She could tell you a story about it. And I always loved her stories because they weren't judgmental. She wasn't criticizing people. She was just describing life as she had lived it, or repeating stories that had been told to her in the case of things that were farther back in the past. And so even though I didn't see that grandmother, Emma, as often as I saw my grandmother on the Mitchell side, I heard stories about her. My mother would talk often about what it was like growing up. My mother was one of 12 kids. She was the oldest daughter, whereas here I was just one kid. And so I was always interested in what's it like to have 11 siblings versus being an only kid.
Very different.
And she would tell me those stories.
What was your mom, Ophelia's relationship like with Emma, her mother, your grandmother?
It was close. They were a large, close family. There was more friction with her father, who was this very authoritarian British West Indian culture. I actually did some research in the Caribbean when I was in graduate school. I lived in Jamaica, but I also went to the island that my grandfather was from, which was in the Eastern Caribbean, because I wanted to get a better understanding of this culture of his that had, on the one hand, shaped my mother a lot, but it had also alienated her. So her father was kind of strict, remote, very class-oriented, that British tradition. Mm-hmm. He also had, very high expectations for his kids, which they appreciated, even though he had this huge family of 12 kids. I think 11 of them attended college. They were the only kids in their little community where they lived, the only black family where the children finished high school, because most of the black families, the kids would drop out of school and go work in domestic service. So he had these values. You're going to do more in life. You're going to accomplish more. Emma had those values as well, but Emma had a more loving nature. And all of the kids were very close to her, always spoke very lovingly of her. And Emma's mother, who I don't have a photograph of her in my book, but I refer to her frequently. Emma's mother, who was named Isabella, was another very important figure in my mom's life because she lived with them. By the time my mother was, say, 8 or 9, her grandmother would have been like in her 70s or so. She lived to be almost 90. But her grandmother, my mother's grandmother, was born in 1848. So she was like 12 at the time of the Civil War started. And she would tell my mother all kinds of stories of those early days in Pennsylvania. And my mother told me those stories so that, I've always felt like the past had a different quality for me. Some people, sadly don't even know who their parents are, much less their grandparents. Whereas I grew up in this kind of ocean of stories on my mother's side about her mother and her grandmother and her great grandmother. And it was usually, the values of these people were brave, these people were strong, they were determined, and always that education theme. They were pursuing education even when it was very difficult, as you can imagine, in those early days in Pennsylvania for Black people to get an education. They basically had to organize schools on their own and do it for themselves because the state did not educate them. Because of the Quakers, Pennsylvania was a little bit better than being in the South. They had ended slavery after the Revolutionary War, and they had something they called gradual emancipation, which meant that they were gradually emancipating Black people from slavery, so that the last slaves were freed maybe in, let's just say, like the 1830s or so in Pennsylvania. So people like my mom's family, they were technically free, but they couldn't vote, for instance. It was difficult for them to own land. And technically, the state of Pennsylvania was supposed to make schools available to them, except it didn't. So they had to really be in charge of their own education. And those were some of the stories that I heard about, which just I would say that the commitment to being educated that those earlier generations demonstrated, was always communicated to me as why you have to be committed to education as well. This is the path to our freedom.
It wasn't as though the faucet was on and then off as far as freedom. It was this gradual historical event. 2 years after things had been signed, it's still people were enslaved.
Yeah, and no safety net. This is the thing when you read about that period. Like I said, you think, well, it's Pennsylvania, so it's not the South. It's better than the South in some respects, but it's, it was far from heaven. And these were families with no safety net other than the one they could construct for themselves. Right. And that's even the case in the period of my book, Emma's Postcard Album, which was the early 1900s, where now all the Black people are free, and they are on the one hand trying to build colleges and fraternities and sororities and mutual aid organizations and an infrastructure, but they had to do that because the federal government was not supporting them in any respect. That there was no safety net for them it was a very slippery slope.
If they didn't fight for themselves, they really didn't have support from the outside.
That's right.
And education was key. What are other gifts that your mom gave you?
Well, She was a musician. She played piano. I used to. Oh, when you mentioned doing adventures with my mother, that would be another adventure at the house. Her playing the piano and us singing together. I have many, many fond memories of that. And she loved to kind of play the piano with all of these extraneous flourishes and things just to make me laugh. And I would having fun laughing together. She was very good at languages and spoke several languages and was always telling me, everybody needs to speak at least one foreign language. But she spoke French and she spoke Spanish. She could read German. She could read Latin. I never matched her score in that regard, but I did learn French.
Is your mom's presence stronger with her absence?
With her absence? Well, I will tell you I have a complex answer for that, Jackie. I would say yes. What happened was, as she got older, much like her namesake Ophelia, she actually entered a period of depression, and that was something she was not able to talk about very well. Even though she was a griot in other respects, it was hard for her to talk about being depressed. I know it's often hard for people to talk about that, and so she, she became literally kind of quieter and more turned inside as she got older. And that was very difficult for me. I'm the only kid and wanting to have the same kind of relationship I had when I was younger. And it changed. When I had my daughter, I felt like I saw a return to some of the mother that I remembered. She really came alive with my daughter and was teaching her, and singing to her and doing the things that I remembered from my childhood. So I would say once my mother died, the troubled times ended, and I was able to, think about her and remember her in those more positive tones, because I wasn't struggling in some ways anymore.
I think that's, we all have our different things that we're struggling with and fighting with. And some, it's like childbirth, you forget what it's really like. Mm-hmm. So your mom was transitioning, and, it's hard when you're getting older. Maybe she didn't feel as significant or important, or she couldn't learn. There's so many different things, complex thoughts that are going on. But from what I can gather in this 30-minute conversation is that she really made an effort to give you the best that she could with what she had.
Oh, totally. She definitely did. Yes, she did not hold back.
She wanted you to see that light. And I think my gosh, if you hadn't become an anthropologist or an ethnographer, can you imagine who you would be today? You love all of this.
Well, if what you mean is if I hadn't kept pushing and pursuing, I would feel so cheated, And yes, I'm completely grateful,
You're grateful, and I so appreciate that. Dr. Faith Mitchell, her book is entitled Emma's Postcard Album. Thank you for sharing these stories of Ophelia and your grandmother Emma and your great-grandmother Isabel. Oral history, we must keep this tradition alive.
Thank you, Jackie.
And we will be back next week with another episode of Should Have Listened to My Mother.